Good evening. I'm Alex Tock. I'm the director of the Tommy G. Thompson Center on Public Leadership. The Thompson Center is delighted to be able to partner with the UW-La Crosse College of Business Administration to bring Sir Paul Tucker here tonight. I want to thank Dean Brooks, Mary, and everyone here at UW-La Crosse, as well as the Thompson Center staff, Ruth and Tia, for making this event possible. For those unfamiliar with the Thompson Center, let me just say a few words about it. The Thompson Center was established to follow in the footsteps of Governor Thompson, who proudly worked with both sides of the aisle to promote effective public policy and advance the public good. The Thompson Center seeks to inspire current and future leaders, promote leadership skills, and advance effective public policy. We work to further these goals by holding events, scholarships, and funding research all across the UW system. And we're currently soliciting grant proposals for both speaker grants and research grants. So if you're affiliated with UW-La Crosse or any UW school, I encourage you to think about applying for those. We also have a number of upcoming events in April, including hosting Jeb Bush on Thursday of this week in Waukesha, and hosting Admiral Stavridis, former Supreme Commander of NATO, in Madison on the 21st. For more information about our grants, about those events, and about anything else for the Thompson Center, please visit our website. Tonight, I'm pleased to be able to introduce Sir Paul Tucker. Paul completed his undergraduate studies at Trinity College, Cambridge, where he majored in mathematics and philosophy. He began his career at the Bank of England after graduating, rising through the ranks to become the deputy governor of the Bank of England with responsibility for financial stability in 2009. Internationally, he also served on the steering committee of the G20 Financial Stability Board and the board of the Bank of International Settlements. Sir Paul left the Bank of England in 2013 after a 33-year career. The following year, he was knighted for services to central banking. His contributions to reforming the bank resolution framework and other reforms to improve financial stability have been widely hailed. Since leaving the Bank of England, Sir Paul has continued to speak, write, and work on issues of monetary policy and financial stability. He's a fellow at the Harvard Kennedy School and chaired the Systemic Risk Council from 2015 to 2021. His book, Unelected Power, The Quest for Legitimacy in Central Banking and the Regulatory State, was published by Princeton University Press and has been praised by economists from Paul Volcker to John Taylor. Sir Paul's remarks tonight will be followed by a Q&A with Dean Brooks. So thank you again all for coming. Thank you, Dean Brooks, and everyone here for making this possible. But now I'm pleased to turn the stage over to Sir Paul.
Well, thank you very much, and thanks for giving up your time. This is a talk about the power of an economic institution. And so much of the talk is really about politics, political science, political economy, even political theory in the background. When we get to the Q&A, we may want to talk about inflation and unemployment and the world economy and stuff like that. But my focus initially is on the Federal Reserve and other central banks as powerful institutions led by unelected people like me, in the past. The talk has 5 or 6 sections. The first is that the way we think about constitutional structures has a gap in it. It doesn't really cater for these very powerful unelected agencies, with the exception of the judiciary. The second is a bit closer to economics. It's why should central bank independence work? Not kind of is it decent, but why might it succeed? And that actually is going to be related to an explanation for why we currently have some of the inflation problems, although I might leave part of that to Q&A. The third, which is just one slide, I'm going to make a case for central bank independence based on our constitutional values, in particular separation of powers. The fourth section will be, well, if you give these unelected people so many powers, even if it works in terms of welfare, how can that possibly be decent in a representative democracy? How can it be legitimate? And I'm going to set out some conditions, some principles that need to be satisfied in order for it to be decent. I then, in the fifth section, will cash out what that might mean in practice for the kind of ways that the Federal Reserve uses its balance sheet and its role in the banking sector. And then, it says if time, I will make time by skipping other things if necessary. I want to end by comparing what it's like to be an independent central banker with what it's like to be a member of the Supreme Court and what it's like to be Chief of the Defense Staff. And I've got quotes from some of them that kind of bring out, I think, some quite subtle distinctions. So the problem is a gap in constitutionalism. This country in particular, but not only this country, is now a political community where an awful lot of government is handed over to unelected heads of agencies, central bankers, and activist judges. And when I think of activist judges, by the way, I don't think of that as either a right-wing thing or a left-wing thing. I think that judges on both sides of politics in this country have been visibly partisan for a very long time. And I think that would have surprised people a long time ago. Putting the judges on one side, if you go back to the great thinkers and architects of constitutionalism, all men, I'm afraid, but men that were much more practical than many 20th century and 21st century political theorists, people like Montesquieu and John Locke, and here most famously James Madison, who was a kind of theorist as well as a practitioner. They think in terms of this three-branch state, legislature, executive, and judiciary. And they have no conception of what today in the United States would be called the administrative state, and in my continent would be called the regulatory state. They have no place for this in their constitutional setup, and yet that's where most of government happens today. And I think this gap in constitutionalism needs to be filled in with principles that kind of constrain what can be given to these unelected agencies. And let me just say, as kind of an aside that I'm prepared to be challenged on, I think the Supreme Court here, and to some extent the main courts in continental Europe, have done a really lousy job in thinking about this over the last 50, 100 years or so, which isn't to say that they haven't spent a great deal of time on it. Let me define an independent agency. This is actually particularly important in the United States, given the jurisprudence. So by an independent agency, I mean an agency that is insulated from quotidian, from day-to-day politics of both elected branches. So insulated from the day-to-day politics of both Congress and the executive branch. And I would suggest that whether or not that's a good thing, just in terms of it being a thing, three conditions have to be satisfied for an agency to be independent in the sense I define it. The first is that they have control over their instruments, that somebody can't get on the phone and tell them what to do. They might try to tell them what to do. They might go on to the radio or television and try and tell them what to do, but actually they can't decide for the agency. The second is that the office holders have job security. That doesn't mean that they can necessarily carry on until they're 90. It just means that the president, or in my country, the prime minister, can't get out of bed, decide that they're fed up with you and sack you. And then thirdly, there has to be a degree of budgetary autonomy, that you don't have to go back to elected politicians every year for your budget, because if you do, then they've got a hefty lever over how you use your policy instruments. Now, for those of you that know the American legal system, the court here defines an independent agency as an agency that fulfills the second criterion, job security, that the president can't sack the job holder without just cause. And that applies to lots of agencies, including the Securities and Exchange Commission and the Federal Trade Commission, as well as the Federal Reserve. But with those other agencies, they do not have budgetary autonomy. They have to go back to Congress each year for their money, and Congress can proscribe and prescribe. So the United States actually has very few independent agencies in the way that I define independence. And one of the reasons I was kind of sweepingly critical of jurisprudence here is that it has not subtly distinguished between different degrees and kinds of independence. But for the purposes of this talk, the Federal Reserve, for good or ill, has all of those three attributes. The president can't sack Powell. The FOMC can set interest rates or its balance sheet more or less as it likes within the constraints of the law, and it doesn't have to go to Congress each year for budgetary appropriations. So I've already alluded to this. These people, my former tribe, are incredibly powerful today. I mean, they are essentially a third pillar of unelected power alongside the military and the judiciary. And that image, the military and the judiciary are so different. The military is under civilian control. The judiciary is not under political control. That where in the spectrum the central bank has come is kind of quite a rich question. One of the things to understand about a central bank is that because it has a balance sheet, it has quasi-fiscal powers. It can substitute itself or be encouraged to substitute itself for the fiscal policy of government, for the elective branches of government. Not to say they always do that, but they are latently capable of doing that. And they are latently capable of, through surprise inflation, of taxing you. So the monetary instrument is always latently an instrument of taxation. This will be very important to an argument I'll come back to in a while. But it's not, typically debates about central banks focus on those issues, but they are also regulators of banks and of other parts of finance. So they write rules that are legally binding norms. So they can't have some of the powers of Congress. You think about Congress, or in my country, Parliament is writing the laws. Well, I wrote some laws with my colleagues. We passed them, and they banned people, and people could be punished for not complying with those laws. So they're also lawmakers, subsidiary lawmakers, but nevertheless lawmakers. There's no conception of that in the founding fathers of political thought. And then, since I wrote the book, something else has happened. That, again, for good or ill, there's been a lot of pressure and encouragement on the Federal Reserve, the European Central Bank, and others to use both their regulatory powers and their balance sheet powers to promote curing the problems of climate change and curing some of the ills of inequality. And typically, they're encouraged to do this by setting higher regulatory standards in certain areas, or setting more restrictive collateral policies on their balance sheet. And for an economist, this is equivalent to setting up a Pigouvian tax. The idea is not to raise money, the idea is to deter people from doing things that are socially costly. And like a kind of ordinary tax, a Pigouvian tax is on the whole something that you would think of, or we have habitually thought of for the past 250 years, something that Congress would do, or the Parliament in my country. So actually, a central bank, because it's got a balance sheet and can print money, can substitute itself for pretty much any activity of central government other than the military, which is quite a thing. And so the question is, should they, and where should the boundaries lie, and who should decide where the boundaries are? Now, I'm going to make a sweeping statement, and this lies behind almost everything I'm going to say. That mostly when economists think about institutions, they say the institutions will have to be incentive compatible for the actors around the institution. Basically, incentive compatible things happen, non-incentive compatible things don't happen, and therefore we need to design institutions in a way that it's not just parchment, but everybody has incentives to abide by the design of the institution. This is tremendously important, and people have rightly won the Nobel Prize for this over the last 20 years or so. It's insufficient. Our institutions also need to be values compatible. An institution that is incentives compatible, but not values compatible, not compatible with the values that supposedly animate the institution, will not enjoy legitimacy, and it won't endure. Let me say something that might be controversial, I'm not sure, something I believe for what it's worth. I think that where the US Constitution has settled in terms of the three main branches of government is incentive compatible, but not values compatible. Basically, Congress has incentives to delegate much of the task of lawmaking to regulatory agencies, and the court has incentives to let Congress do that rather than to step in and substitute its own view for what the law should be in lots of micro areas. So this is incentive compatible for the executive, because they get a bit more lawmaking power. For Congress, remember that I think it's the case, the political scientists will know better than me, I think it's the case that the average member of the House spends about 70% of their time on fundraising. So by delegating lawmaking to regulatory agencies in the executive branch, they have more time to do fundraising and less time to do legislating. And it's incentive compatible for the court, because the court gets to write the laws where they want to, rather than writing the laws absolutely everywhere. So I've obviously put that in a rather stark way, and I put it in a stark way because the idea that the elected legislature delegating the task of lawmaking is hardly compatible with the values that supposedly animate a representative democracy with an elected legislature, Congress, at its heart. So you don't have to buy that 100%. Actually, I kind of more or less do buy that 100%, but you don't have to buy that 100% to think this idea of values compatibility kind of ranks with incentive compatibility as important. Without incentive compatibility, you don't get anything. But values compatibility addresses the question, well, are you getting what your broader constitutional norms, this is true for any country, say you ought to be? So just have that in the back of your mind as what's kind of going on. It won't be front of stage all of the time. So the next few remarks are going to be about the political economy, the incentives of central bank independence. So all of this is initially about, irrespective of whether it's a good idea or a bad idea, just why might people want to make a central bank, a monetary authority, independent? The standard political science story here, kind of well documented by a man called Adam Posen, who is now the boss of the Peterson think tank in Washington, is that this is all to do really with interest groups. The right wing tends to be on the side of finance. Finance prefers low inflation to high and volatile inflation. Therefore, right-wing legislators will grant central bank independence. I think this story is, I think there's something in it. I think it misses an awful lot. So my country, and this may be a story about parliamentary democracy rather than a kind of congressional presidential democracy, although I'm not convinced of that. In my country, the Bank of England was made independent by the Tony Blair New Labour government, not by the right. And why might this be so? So Mrs. Thatcher, who was our Prime Minister from 1979 to 1991, I think, maybe 1990, she really did believe inflation ought to be low, and her governments consistently failed to deliver low inflation, so her sincerity and her actions didn't match. She was pressed by her Treasury secretaries, by at least two of them, hard to make the Bank of England independent, and she declined. Why do I think this is so? I think in a two-party system with first past the post, if the right-wing party think that it's going to be better at controlling inflation than the left-wing party, and the right-wing party is commonsensical enough to realize that they won't be in government all of the time, but will occasionally lose elections to the left-wing party, then they think the left-wing party's spending habits and the inflation that it might give rise to will help bring the right-wing party back into power. So if you thought you were going to be in power forever, that argument doesn't work, but no top politician I've known actually believes in their heart of hearts that their party is going to win forever. And the best of them think about what will help their party get back into power. And leaving the left-wing party with the poison pill of political decisions on interest rates is a route to bring them back into power. So this is how it played out in the UK. The Blair-Brown government in 1997 gave the Bank of England independence through Parliament in order to protect themselves from themselves, as it were. The interesting thing then is, well, why doesn't the right-wing party repeal independence when they got back into power? And initially, I don't want to get too involved in British politics, initially the Tory opposition in 1997 said they would do that. When they got back into government many years later, but actually years before they got back into government, they changed their mind and said they wouldn't do it. Now, why might this be so? So here's a bit of economics. I'm going to argue many people, particularly many people on the soft left today, on both sides of the Atlantic, think that Federal Reserve, Bank of England, ECB are part of some kind of neoliberal ramp. I think it's complete nonsense, actually. I think it's not, I mean, certainly some of the office holders may be neoliberal, but I think it's complete nonsense at the level of the economics. Here's why. When inflation is high and volatile, and maybe we're going to live with this over the next few years, who knows, but when in the past it's been high and volatile, bond market yields not only compensate for expected inflation, but they charge a risk premium for the uncertainty of inflation. That risk premium is not a wash. The compensation, the extra yield compensating for high expected inflation is a wash if on average the expectation is true. I'm being compensated for 6% inflation. It turns out on average to be 6% inflation. There's no kind of real return to the investor from that or real cost to the borrower, the government, from that. The risk premium, however, is a real burden. It is a real cost. When the Bank of England was made independent in 1997, the calculations, long-term bond yields, the forward rates actually, for those of you that kind of finance people, fell by about 50 basis points. And years later, when people have got the techniques, they calculated that about 25 basis points of that fall was a fall in expected inflation, which was already quite low, and 25 basis points was a fall in the risk premium. At the time, the average real interest rate was about 2.5. So this was a reduction of about 10% in the real cost of government borrowing. This is gigantic. This is gigantic. I used to be the UK government debt manager in the mid-1990s. If you could, and I know it's the same in the US Treasury, and the French Treasury is very sophisticated at this stuff as well. If you can have a debt management strategy that saves you a basis point here or there, you're doing great things for the country that you serve. 25 basis points is just enormous. But this is completely politically neutral. If you're a right-wing party, that great savings on the whole of your debt, you can give away in tax cuts. If you're on the left of politics, you can use those savings in terms of higher welfare or whatever you want to spend the money on. The saving, the fact that the country has saved a lot of real resource is just a fact. The politics comes in how that saving is then deployed in society, and we hold elections for that. And what this means, to the extent this is true, even if a left-wing party grants independence, a right-wing party isn't then going to remove it and incur the risk premium, because then it will have fewer resources than the people it's just replaced to pursue their own project. This, by the way, is completely unexplored in the economics literature. Now, what I haven't said is why making a central bank independent from monetary policy might work. Why might it be better at keeping inflation low and stable rather than highly volatile than the president, the prime minister? And a curious thing about this is for decades, there's been an argument about why it is a bad idea to have monetary policy in the hands of elected politicians, but not going further than that. The argument why the elected politicians shouldn't decide monetary policy is that they can declare, this is what Mrs. Thatcher lived through, they can declare that they are committed to price stability, but then they won't want to keep their promise. And they won't want to keep their promise because as elections approach, they will want the economy to be strong, unemployment to be high, and participation in the labour force to be high, and unemployment to be low. And so they'll pump the economy up so we all feel quite happy. And if the consequent inflation comes through after the election, doesn't matter so much, still won the election. And many of you either have or will come across politicians. Politicians' desire to win, and actually to survive, to carry on being a politician, depends entirely on winning elections. Pursuing the best policy for the medium term and not getting re-elected, it's not just kind of selfishness. The best of them think that really does leave the country worse off because they would make it better off with their policies. And so, yeah, if you cheat on inflation, that's a fine thing to do. But this is an argument why you wouldn't necessarily want to leave monetary policy with elected politicians. It's a variant of what's called the time inconsistency problem, that the people can't make a credible promise because they have incentives to exploit it in the short run. That doesn't at all, though, address the question of why might my tribe be better at it. And I think the answer has to be something like that, because we're just talking about people, men and women, who care about themselves and their families and their friends and want to do well in life, and some are kind of crazily ambitious, and many are proud. For it to work, we have to harness their incentives. And we need people who care about the prestige and public esteem, the professional prestige and the public esteem and the public standing they will get from delivering the mandate that they have been set. That it's not only that we know we can't harness the politician, but we need to be able to harness my former colleagues. And that's quite a big thing. And to the extent that we've had a problem with inflation over the last period, it's because that harness has loosened in interesting ways. So we need to design these regimes in ways that incentives, we harness the incentives, we harness the, if you like, the ambition and the desire for public standing and professional prestige of the people that lead the Federal Reserve and the Bank of England and elsewhere. Now, say you're the politician and you really want to undermine this independence, because it's very inconvenient, because they keep on raising interest rates in the run-up to an election or something like that. Remember Paul Volcker did that to Jimmy Carter in 1979, which created the Reagan administration. So there's no doubt that central banks do things that affect the outcomes of elections. Not the only thing that affects the outcome of elections. So if you get politicians that kind of hate this independent central banking stuff, how would you undermine it? There are two ways of undermining it. One is appointments and the other is the mandate, and each has crude and subtle variants. So let's take appointments. The crude way is you just appoint, this is kind of Reagan's personalis policy. You appoint somebody and get Congress to confirm somebody as the chair of the Fed or the number two in the Fed, who is completely a political ally, and overtly a political ally. But everybody can see that he or she is a political ally, so that's kind of rather obvious. So the first subtle version of this is you appoint somebody, you nominate and confirm somebody who looks like an expert and maybe is truly an expert, but actually is in a slightly obscure way your political ally. So their credentials look great, and so people won't necessarily suspect that they're going to be doing politics. The most famous example of this in central banking comes from this country. It's Arthur Burns, who was a Chicago professor, a great business cycle economist, working at the Fed. I nearly said working for Richard Nixon, which he was, in the early, through the 1970s. And the White House transcripts during that period didn't just reveal all the Watergate terrible stuff. It revealed loads of other incredible things. So there is a transcript in the run-up to the, have I got the year right, the 1972 presidential election, where Arthur Burns goes to see Richard Nixon, and I've read this transcript. And I couldn't believe it when I reached the bit that says, one of them says to the other, the election's getting close, we really need to get the economy going. I've got those words almost exactly right, I'm sure not 100% right. So who do you think says that? Do you think the president's saying that, and he's putting pressure on the Fed chair? Arthur Burns says that to Richard Nixon. He was a disgrace. He later on gave a speech called The Anguish of Central Banking, and so he might have done. He was a disgrace because the Fed was independent. Not a disgrace to be politically partisan. It's a disgrace to hold an independent position under the law and sell it to your party's president. They didn't treat him very well for it either, so what he sold it for, I don't know. Anyway, that's one thing you can do. Burns definitely looked like the real thing, and as an economist he was, but he absolutely didn't act in line with the law. The other one is, well, you can change the mandate. You can repeal their independence, or you can reduce their independence, but that's highly visible. And bond yields will go up, and we live in worlds where governments borrow loads of money, and so people would quickly calculate that there was less money to be spent on welfare or tax cuts because bond yields have gone up. So that's kind of a rather crude way of doing it. It happens in authoritarian states. A more subtle way, this is kind of what the political right tends to try to do, is actually it's kind of reduce the instruments and the powers that the central bank has to make it more difficult to fulfill their mandate. And then they might do what we want them to do, so that we won't take away their powers. So this is a kind of threat thing, and an earlier one of these talks, I should think that Sarah Binder kind of gave examples from that, from her study of bills on the Fed tabled over many decades. The approach of the left tends to be, give them more responsibilities. I don't know, if these days, in a different generation, it would be different things, but today it would be responsibilities for inequality, responsibilities for climate change, things that are quite political in some ways, certainly inequality, so that any decent office holder would want to steer from the president or the prime minister how they should use these powers. Or more subtly, and I think this has been going on a bit more in continental Europe than the States, is I can now be popular with the country for doing good things and making the world a better place and the country a better place, even while I neglect my core mission of inflation. The more things I do, the more opportunities I have to be popular with you. So finally, there's a bit of a non sequitur here, but I hope you'll see why later. Even if the politicians haven't tried to undermine the central bank's independence through subtle appointments of allies, expert allies, or broadening the mandate, or taking away powers. So it's just a kind of orthodox central bank in some sense, again for good or ill still. There's still a kind of very nasty problem where the central bank turns out to be the only game in town, which has been more or less the case over the past 10 years. The way to think about it is this. Something really bad affects the economy, and it's going to need a powerful response. And most experts, irrespective of their politics, agree that it should be a mixture of fiscal stimulus and monetary stimulus. And the central bank governor, the chair of the Fed, although I have no particular central bank in mind because it applies to all of them, this story, has a meeting with the Treasury Secretary or the President or the Prime Minister, and they agree that what economists would call the optimum policy mix has some fiscal stimulus and some monetary stimulus. And then the central banker leaves the room and the politician is left with his or her advisors. And the advisors point out that to get the fiscal package through, they're going to have to carry the vice president, they're going to have to carry their party in both the Senate and the House, they're going to have to carry their base, they're going to have to carry some donors, they're going to have to carry the newspapers and media channels that support them. And this isn't going to be easy. Some people aren't going to like it, and they're going to pay some costs for this. Political scientists call this political transaction costs. And so the president or prime minister says, yeah, you're right. But look, the right thing to do is the mix. This is going to be uncomfortable for me. And the advisors press on that this is going to be a bad thing for them politically. And eventually the president or prime minister says, okay. What happens if I don't do anything? And they say, oh, the central bank will do more. And the president or the prime minister says, well, okay then. Let's let the central bank do more. And it's a very interesting thing that central bank independence is a solution to the problem of politicians doing things that aren't good for the country, cutting interest rates during a boom or something. Kind of works for that. But no one yet has a solution to the problem of how do you get the politicians do something that they should do rather than rely entirely on monetary policy to fix all of our macroeconomic problems. I do not have a solution to that. All of that so far is more or less in the realm of positive economics rather than normative economics. I'm going to say something normative from political theory. So the standard case for central bank independence is there's a time inconsistency problem. The politician will definitely fall victim to it. The unelected person may not if we design the apparatus skillfully. That's a good thing to do because inflation being low and the business cycle being smoothed will on the whole lead to higher welfare over many years. I believe that argument. But I think there's another argument, a constitutional argument. When we think of the separation of powers, often we think of adjudication of the law, the judiciary being separate from the making of the law. And of course that's hugely important. But there's another element of separation of powers as well, as it happens deep in the history of my country, which is the separation of executive government and the legislature that decides taxation. The origin of the English Parliament in, I think, the 13th century is the barons rising up against the king and saying, you won't decide taxes, we will decide taxes. This is the kind of first on a very long journey towards a form of representative democracy. If you give the executive branch, the president or the prime minister, the monetary tool, they do not need to raise resources under the authority of Congress or Parliament, because they can print money. Crudely, the way of thinking about this, it's a bit exaggerated, is if President Trump had controlled the printing presses, he would have had his wall, because he could have paid for the wall. When I presented this argument to one group of people in the States, they said, but Congress doesn't just approve the taxes, it actually has to approve the spending. So what? If I've got the money, I just go and spend it. What is Congress going to do? Send the military down to do it? Oh, look, the military doesn't report to the Congress. The power of taxation, the power to raise resources, is absolutely fundamental. The last people, if we believe in the separation of powers, the last bit of government that we should want to control monetary policy is the executive branch, whether it's your system of government or in a parliamentary system of government. So then what can we do? So say everyone agrees about that, and we're just not going to do that. We did it for a while, by the way, during the 1970s, and it worked really badly, because the elected politicians did exactly what I've just described. So then what we do? Well, for a long time, constitutional democracies or liberal states solved this problem through the gold standard. There was a kind of binding rule. I don't mean the early 20th century gold exchange standard for cognoscenti here, but the 19th century gold standard. That was in Britain, that was Parliament. That was when Britain went onto gold, that was Parliament. When it came off gold occasionally, that was Parliament. When it went back onto gold, that was Parliament. That wasn't the Bank of England, that wasn't the Prime Minister, although of course those people had to kind of agree in some sense. This broke in the early 20th century because it doesn't fit with full franchise democracy. The gold standard is terrific at maintaining price stability. And you get economic activity goes like this, which is fine in positive political science terms in a world where the only electors are property holders, and absolutely appalling as soon as you've got full franchise democracy. Something like the gold standard can't be your substitute anchor in a full franchise democracy. So then you've got two choices left. One is to have some kind of committee of Congress or Parliament to do it. Well, that means you've given over the taxation power to kind of a subset of Parliament rather than the Congress. And secondly, it's incredibly time-consuming doing monetary policy. Or you try and create an institution that is kind of insulated from politics and then design it in a way where it doesn't become the monarch, because it's now got the latent taxation power. And that's where we have been since about the 1980s, 1990s. Now, so let me run through some of the constraints that I think need to apply to such an institution, and then I'm going to get to my comparisons between the army and the military, and the army, the judiciary, and the central banks. First of all, you should only give this power to these unelected people if there's basically bipartisan support for it, that everybody more or less thinks that it's broadly the right thing to do. I think a striking thing about not only this country but elsewhere is you might think that environmental policy should be put in the hands of an independent agency. And I bet quite a lot of you would find that attractive. But there's nothing like bipartisan support for it. And you may find that very aggravating, I think I do, but there isn't. It's no accident that the EPA it's not even independent in the sense of the SEC. It is an agency more or less under the direct control of the president of the day. And that is because our societies, certainly this society, doesn't have anything close to a consensus on environmental issues and climate change. A second one, number 3 here, is you don't want to hand choices on distributional issues to this unelected central bank, because distributional issues are meant to be forged by representative democracy. That's quite a big deal. 4, you want the legislature to set an objective that we, interested people, and therefore any interested member of the public, can comprehend and track. Can't be mumbo jumbo to interested members of the public, and it has to be possible to track it. And that's so that we can see whether they're succeeding in achieving the objective, and actually if they're not succeeding, we can form a view whether they were trying but had bad luck. Whereas if it's completely opaque or vague, how do we even know whether they were trying? How do we know whether they had bad luck or were incompetent or were mendacious in some way? A 5th one, which I don't want to, I probably won't discuss too much, is you absolutely don't want to delegate this to one person. You want to delegate it to a committee, because otherwise that person becomes too powerful. That's a kind of Republican value. That's not, some of these other things reflect liberal values. This is a Republican value, small r for Republican. A 6th one is you want transparency. Again, this is a kind of Republican thing, really, so that you can track what's happening in your name, because there's a double delegation here. You to Congress, Congress to the Federal Reserve. I want to say one thing on the way about banking stability, and then I'll get to the military and the judiciary. So I think central banks should have rather few functions, but I do think they should be responsible for stability of the banking system. And that's because most of the money that we use today, may change, most of the money we use is the money in our checking accounts. It's not dollar bills. We don't have accounts of the Federal Reserve or Bank of England. Money for us is stuff that we hold with our local bank or some big money centre bank. In 1990, shortly after he'd retired, Paul Volcker gave a speech, The Triumph of Central Banking. The question mark was tremendously important. And he said, I insist that neither monetary policy nor the financial system will be well served if a central bank loses interest in or influence over the financial system. Sweeping statement I'm about to make, which I sincerely believe. The global financial crisis happened because the Federal Reserve lost interest in the financial system under Alan Greenspan. And in the UK, the world's other big international financial centre, the Bank of England lost influence over it because its regulatory functions were transferred outside on the grounds that we would be too powerful if we were responsible for both monetary policy and for banking stability. And one of the things I did is I persuaded a later government to hand those powers back after the financial crisis. Now, and we could debate whether that's a good thing or a bad thing. So I want to read 3 quotes to you. I think the first of these is absolutely remarkable, although I think the other two are pretty interesting. Is the print big enough for you to see it? I'll read it anyway. So this man, Field Marshal Alan Brooke, was the British counterpart to George Marshall during the Second World War. He was when Britain was still, certainly at the beginning, still a major military power. And he was a very great strategist. I think he was a very great man. I think George Marshall was a very great man, but I think Alan Brooke was a very great man. And he had rows with Winston Churchill, where the rows would go on all day. One of Churchill's qualities in the Second World War, not in the First World War, was that where people disagreed with him, he would carry on debating with them because the stakes were so high. And there was one day where, I think this is in 1943 or 44, where they really have argued for a day. And at the end of the day, General Ismay, who was Churchill's kind of chief of staff on the military side, and who was the first Secretary General of NATO, so quite a big figure in his own right, goes to see Brooke and says, this is all documented at the time by various secretaries and officials in Downing Street in London. And Ismay says to Brooke, the old man thinks you hate him. So this is all pretty emotional stuff. And Brooke, apparently through tears, says, I don't hate him, I do love him. But the day that I say I agree with him when I don't is the day he must get rid of me because I am no use to him anymore. You think about this in the middle of the greatest war of the last century. It's extraordinary. Second one is judiciary. And this isn't an actor. This is a man called Alexander Bickel, who was a professor at Yale, and wrote a book called, I think, The Least Dangerous Branch. And the book is basically an argument for restraint on the part of the Supreme Court. The book obviously has been a complete failure came out, but this is widely regarded as a masterpiece. And Bickel says, the justices have their being near the political marketplace, in which the effects of their judgments are felt. And he means the justices, the Supreme Court judges. A number of controls are built into their craft, which they practice under the scrutiny of a profession whose expectations and approval must matter to them. So the harness for the judges, the justices, is partly their standing within the legal profession itself, he's arguing. The third one is Mervyn King, used to have the office next door to mine, and Jean-Claude Trichet was the president of the European Central Bank during the financial crisis. And when he retired, when Mario Draghi took over, there were big events all over Europe, but one of them, even though we're not part of the euro area, was in London. An enormous dinner. I mean, I don't know, hundreds and hundreds of people there. And Mervyn gave this speech, and he said, central bank governors require three qualities above all: a deep commitment to price stability, an ability to be clear and direct to politicians about the policies that are required to produce economic stability. Notice that's now wider than price stability. And the ability to be unpopular when circumstances require. Now, what's interesting about this, I would say this about central banking, that like the military, but unlike the judiciary, central bankers must be ready to advise in private on the wider government policies that are necessary for monetary system stability. If you heard that Roberts was going to see the president to advise him on legal policy, you'd be rightly outraged. I don't think you should be at all outraged if you hear that Jay Powell is doing that, or that Paul Volcker did that. But remembering the story about Brooke and Churchill arguing for a day and them both being completely raw, I mean, these are two enormous human beings, and they're both in tears at the end of the day, and they're meant to be fighting a war. Unlike that, because Churchill could have sacked Brooke that evening. That evening, Brooke existed at Churchill's pleasure, but the central bank governor doesn't. They have job security. So unlike the military, although the judiciary can't go along to the Prime Minister or President and give advice, the central bank governor can. But unlike the chief of staff. They can't press and press and press. They can't nag. They deliver their advice and they leave the room, and they can't campaign for their advice. Unlike the military, they can repeat their advice in public. Not in a campaigning way, but it's perfectly proper for a central bank governor to disclose to the public what they have said to the elected politicians because they hold independent power. It's completely improper, subject to certain qualifications, when the military do that. And this is difficult. During the Vietnam War, this led to the top generals in the United States dissembling, to put it mildly, in front of Congress about the advice they were giving to Lyndon Johnson. But I think that's a very hard case. But what we can say about the central banker is they can advise in private, not nag, but they should be free to say in public what they have said in private. Finally, on this part of it, they can't be in the business of offering their opinion to the Prime Minister or the President on things they happen to know about because they're them. They have to limit the advice they give to things that are integral to them being, their institution being able to fulfill their mission. So if you have a central bank governor, chair of the Federal Reserve, who happens to be an expert in transport policy or education policy, they are not free, I would say, to give advice on those things to the President or the Prime Minister. Only things that are relevant to whether they can fulfill their mission. Like the judiciary, they can't go around giving advice in public or in private about things they might have to decide. You can't say what interest rates are going to be before you decided what they're going to be, because particularly in a committee system, like the judiciary, they need to be able to explain their institution to the public. The Fed was slow to get to this. It really only started doing this after Alan Greenspan and under Ben Bernanke. You remember that Ben Bernanke, well, some of you remember that Ben Bernanke went on television to, I forget the show, I watched it actually, towards the end of the financial crisis. And this was thought to be an enormous thing. We'd been doing that for, I don't know, 10 to 15 years by then. The idea that you should hold so much power and that somebody living in Idaho or Arizona doesn't actually know what you look like is a terrible thing. When you go on television, you can't pretend to be more than you are. You can't pretend to be responsible for more than Parliament or Congress have given you for it. And like the judiciary, finally, you've got to be ready to take criticism. Now, let me say something about current events before, as a way of bridging to the Q&A. So some of this is broken down. I don't want to overstate this, but I think, for reasons that I think are quite hard to fathom, I would say compared with say 10 or 15 years ago, central bankers are today less harnessed to their core mission than they were. I don't know quite why that's so. It may be because they care less about the professional prestige and public esteem they get from delivering their mission. But I think this is an instructive way of thinking about the high inflation that the United States and parts of Europe have at the moment. This is often framed in terms of the Biden fiscal policy in early 2021 was far too big and it pumped up excess demand in the economy, and then plus some oil price shocks, that's leading to an overheated economy with high inflation. And that debate has partly been around, did Biden make a mistake and did Congress make a mistake in pushing that fiscal package through? The orthodox central banking answer to that is, well, they're elected, they can do whatever they like. And maybe the fiscal package is great. But in terms of stabilizing the economy and keeping inflation low, so we have to withdraw some of the monetary stimulus. And that isn't attacking their fiscal policy. That's actually giving the fiscal policy a greater chance of succeeding. And that didn't happen. And another part of the current debate is that somehow the Federal Reserve made a mistake and they misread the economy. And I find this very hard to believe. I mean, most of the people, not all of them, but most of the people that make that argument are really good at conjunctural economics, but aren't as good as the Federal Reserve machine. Federal Reserve staff are absolutely formidable. So the staff has either degraded in quality over the past 10 years, or they were switched off. And the one thing that was going on in 2021 is the two most important people in the Federal Reserve, both of whom are friends of mine, were running either to be reappointed or to be appointed instead. And a 4-year term with a renewal is a lever for the politicians to bring you to heel. And politics is a kind of brutal old business. So I think we have there a kind of mixture of values and incentives that went wrong. I think the Federal Reserve should move to a chair that has one term of 8 years. And this cuts the other way. Final remarks. I was critical about Alan Greenspan's Fed in passing. I think that's because he went on for too long. I think he consolidated the Volcker disinflation. I mean, Volcker was a truly extraordinary man, a really great, not only a great American public servant, but a great world public servant. But if it had just been him, when his successor turns up, it all falls apart. So that Greenspan consolidated Volcker's disinflation. It's a remarkable achievement. And then there's this incredible thing happens. Volcker got reappointed 4 times, I think. In one of them, I think the last one, the president of the day says something like, well, it would probably be a good idea to get a new Fed chairman, but in the short run, that'd be terrible. We don't want to run the risk in the markets of having a new. So you've got it, I think. The whole idea of having this independent central banker is because you want to lock in some of your the people's long-term objectives, but you end up reappointing this person for short-term reasons. So this problem of being able to reappoint for any number of terms and every 4 years, it's really bad. Thanks very much.
Thank you. So we have some microphones for questions, but I'll take the liberty of the first one. So who gets it right now? What central bank is sort of the best well-designed?
I think if you'd asked this question 5 or 6 or 7 years ago, the consensus view on continental Europe would actually be in the Bank of England. I don't think that's because we're smarter. It's somehow the combination of crises and our parliamentary system makes it possible to pass amending legislation. And if it works, people don't want to repeal it. But I'm not sure people would say that now. I'm not sure any of the major central banks has done well over the past, since about 2016, I would say. I think they became addicted to quantitative easing, partly because of the only game in town problem, but not only that. I should probably come with this a bit later on. I don't think they handled 2020 as well as the current consensus has it. And I think it's not obvious. If these people are kind of meant to be trustees of price stability, and it's no longer that their personal returns come just from that. And I think that's, if I'm right about that, that's quite a big deal. And you can see them trying to play catch up. I mean, I'm not going to name names, but I can think of one Federal Reserve regional president here who's gone in the space of 6 months without the data changing that much, from there isn't an inflationary problem to we might need to raise interest rates by 50 basis points. And I did this stuff for a long time, and it's data that shifts you, and there hasn't been a really big change in the underlying data in the past 6 months.
What about New Zealand and Australia, sort of before COVID? I realize that maybe they haven't managed the best in sort of...
I think the Australian, if you go away from the really big ones,
Yeah.
I think the Australian Central Bank is probably the one I admire most at the moment. New Zealand less so. New Zealand, by the way, was the great innovator. The kind of, I don't know how many people know this. There's this famous expression from Maynard Keynes that says, I'm going to get it slightly wrong, but it says, practical men and women are the slaves and servants of long forgotten philosophers and economists. And it's partly true. And what he didn't recognize is economists and philosophers are sometimes playing catch up with practical men and women who innovated in a great way. And in monetary policy, the great innovation was something called inflation targeting, which began in New Zealand, then picked up by the Swedish central bank, the Riksbank, and my old shop, the Bank of England, 3 or 4 years later, and then everybody. And only then did economists formalize it and work out that it really was a good idea after all. Never believe, especially those of you, the idea that thinking doesn't matter and that scholarly work doesn't matter is ridiculous. It sometimes leads practice, but it's sometimes the other way around. And that's such obvious common sense that Keynes was a great man, but it was a conceit to think that everybody was his intellectual servant.
Other questions? James has one. Yeah.
So one function that you didn't talk about that could be either the monetary authority or the fiscal authority or a combination is balancing the long-run government budget constraint. And thinking about time consistency and economic stability, where should that fall and where is it falling?
People don't know how to solve this problem, I would say. There's a kind of movement, not very strong here, quite strong in parts of Europe, that the long-run budget constraint ought to be delegated to some fiscal equivalent of me. But people don't know how to do that because each year fiscal choices are distributional. And the idea that people like me should make distributional choices is outrageous. So then the question becomes, well, can you determine the budget envelope? And I think where things are at the moment is what you do want is fiscal policy to be based on economic forecasts that are produced by independent people. So the UK has this organization called the Office for Budget Responsibility, and the finance minister, the treasury secretary, is constrained to use the OBR's economic forecasts in the budgetary choices. So to the extent that the finance minister has some fiscal rules, then the forecast plus the policy tweaks determine how close they are to breaching the fiscal rules. You kind of have an equivalent of that in the Congressional Budget Office, but it's really poorly designed. Some of you here will know more about it than me, in that the horizon is limited to 10 years. And so the game is to do things where the costs will start to appear a few months after 10 years. But it can also go the other way. I forget the details. I was involved when I was chairing an international committee. There was something the US was struggling to get through Congress because the benefits were only going to come through after 10 years. So even though everyone agreed it was a good idea, but the benefits couldn't score in the language of these fiscal people. And so this is an example of a poorly designed institution that doesn't serve you as well as it could, I'm afraid. It's terribly difficult to design these things. And the key thing is not to be changing the design of these institutions every week or every month or every year, but not lock them in some kind of religious aspect that they can never be changed when you've learnt something about their strengths and weaknesses. And the 10-year thing is ludicrous, because actually 10 years is a short time. The particular case I was thinking of was around the resolution of banks.
Yeah, that, they make Congress made the rules for how they score too, right? They
Yes.
can't dynamically score.
No.
Right? The counterfactual that they score against is kind of artificial and not sort of based upon real policy. Other questions? So, I have another one. Oh, okay, good.
Hey, just first off, I want to say thanks for the presentation. It was great. I had a question. I guess I was wondering, could you touch on I think a lot of young people don't 100% understand or quite know, even if they know stuff about economics and finance, why inflation is so much higher. I think there's a lot of stuff that's in the news and stuff, but could you maybe touch on what might be the monetary and fiscal policies in the past few years that is why inflation is so much higher than it has been?
Yeah. So there are two reasons, and one of them shouldn't matter, and the other one definitely matters. And when I've explained it, if you say to me, how much of it is it of one and how much of it is the other, I'm not quite sure. And that's partly because I no longer have a big staff to do that kind of thing. But even if I did, I wouldn't be completely sure. So one is, simplifying a lot, is oil prices have gone up. For countries that import all of their energy, that just makes you poorer. So the country is literally poorer on aggregate. Who bears the burden of that is a distributional thing. But the country's just poorer because oil is a key input to more or less everything. I mean, even to today's technology, blockchain is incredibly energy intensive. So even the kind of new digital world is affected by this. We still live in a world of fossil fuels. And even when we don't live in a world of fossil fuels, if the cost of new forms of energy goes up, we will still live in an economy, a world where energy is almost kind of by definition central to economic activity. That should be temporary, and I think my former tribe has made a great mistake over the last 18 months, 2 years, of describing this as inflation and transitory inflation. It's much better to say this is going to push the price level up and it's going to push economic activity down, and that will feature in how we measure inflation. It will turn out, inflation will look as though it's going higher, but it will drop out after a year, assuming there's one shock. If there's a sequence of shocks, then it goes on for longer, but it's the same underlying thing. And for what it's worth, we had a version of that in the UK, well, and in elsewhere as well, in, I forget exactly when, 2010, 2011. And we let inflation go up to 5%. We didn't raise interest rates or anything like that. We were still cutting interest rates because of the crisis. And we said, this will drop out after a year. Actually, there were a few shocks. And I remember saying at one of the meetings, we have a slight problem that we're saying this is a one-off, and we've now had 5 one-offs, and eventually the public are going to say, who are these damn people that say it's one-off? It's going on forever. And then just as I said that, there wasn't another shock, and it dropped out, and inflation came back to 2%. And we got the economics exactly right. We'd had a bit of bad luck in terms of there being more than one shock. But if you're credible, if people believe you mean it about your target of 2%, that will wash out through the system, and it's tough. But you don't have to make it worse by raising interest rates. Stack that for a second, I'll come back to it. The other bit is, big picture, the economy can't spend more than it makes. So demand has to equal supply. So think of supply as some kind of combination of how many people in the economy are working, how long they're working for, how productive they are when they work, and how much capital is there in the economy, and how efficiently that capital is being used. And so the more people that are working, the harder they're working, the more efficiently they're working, the more capital there is, the greater the productive capacity of the economy. but it's still what it is. I mean, calculating that number is quite hard, but it's going to be like here rather than here. So then there's spending in the economy. If you spend less in the economy than your productive capacity, prices are going to fall. If you spend more in the economy than your productive capacity, prices are going to go up. And that's basically, businesses are going to be bidding up. They're going to have the power to charge more for what they sell you, whether it's stuff in the shops or services. And we as workers, everybody's going to want to employ us, and so they're going to bid up wages. And I would say the consensus view is that the fiscal stimulus in 2021 pushed the economy into spending more than its productive capacity. I do not think that works as a criticism of the Biden administration. I think it works as a criticism of the Federal Reserve. So what the Federal Reserve was still stimulating the economy. So basically you've got the Federal Reserve stimulating the economy and the President stimulating the economy. And what should have happened is the Federal Reserve should have said, well, if the President's stimulating the economy, we can stimulate the economy a bit less. And people would have shouted, some people would have shouted, you're undoing what the President's done. At an aggregate level, that's true. In terms of the specific fiscal measures, it's completely untrue. But now we wouldn't have the inflation. And I tell you, I feel very strongly about this next bit especially, that there's, on the left, on both sides of the Atlantic, there was long this feeling that this inflation concern, it's just these kind of neoliberal nutters. When inflation comes, it hurts working people the worst. It doesn't hurt people like me, it hurts people like my former family. And that's what you'll see. It's people that, when the cost of things goes up, they have to decide, do I spend a little bit less? I don't know, do I not go to the bar on Friday than I normally do? Or do I have a little bit less food on the table for my family? And this is incredibly well documented from the 1970s. And then as people try to get through that, this brings me back to the first story, they say, well, I need higher wages. Inflation's going up, I'm going to make up the numbers, 10%. I need a wage increase of 10% so that I can keep up in real terms. That's true. You can't keep up without in real terms without a wage increase of 10%. So then, after a while, people expect inflation to be, in my example, 10%. And so businesses are starting to increase prices by 10%, and workers are trying to get wage increases of 10%. And this isn't doing anything other than pushing up inflation. And then the value of anything that you hold that's nominal, like money or bonds, that's falling in value. So inflation going 2, 3, 4, 1's not a big deal. When you get inflation up to 10% higher, it's very hard to get rid of it without a recession. The biggest criticism of the Fed is if you take risks with inflation, later on you end up causing a recession to squeeze inflation out of the system. When Paul Volcker did that in the early 1980s here, for a while he was the most unpopular man in America. By the mid to late 1980s, he was perhaps the most popular man in America for having cured the inflationary cycle. And we simply should not be having the problems that we've got now. I can't see what the point of having these independent agencies is unless they were prepared to be unpopular a year or so ago. If you go into a central bank and you want to be popular, you're in the wrong line of work.
On credibility, how does average inflation targeting possibly affect credibility or the problems you were just talking about?
So this is a question about a regime change that the Federal Reserve made 2 years ago? Less than that. Headline answer, I think it was fudged and poor. So let me explain why. So the regime they'd been operating before for 15, 20 years, the one that started in New Zealand, said, we're going to aim for 2% inflation and looking out about 2 to 3 years. So obviously things will happen, oil prices going up, oil prices going down, it's symmetric, that will throw us off course in the short run, but we're going to set our interest rates so as to try to land inflation on 2% in about 2 to 3 years time. And obviously we'll miss occasionally, and we'll explain why we think we've missed. In the UK, the Bank of England has to publish a letter to the country, in effect, if inflation is below 1% or above 3%, which isn't always a very comfortable experience, but why should it be? So what the Federal Reserve did, they had a review. I'll explain in a little while why they had the review, but they had a review and decided that rather than targeting inflation in 2 years' time or 3 years' time, they would target inflation on average, which means that if they did this because inflation was running very low. For a number of years, it ran at about 1.5%, 1%. In my view, that's quite close to 2, but they got themselves in a funk about this. And they said, what we're going to do is we're going to target average inflation over a period, so that if we're below target for a while, then we will let inflation go above target for a while, so keep interest rates low, let inflation go above target for a while, and so that it averages 2% over a long period. There are all sorts of difficulties with this, but one of them is, so if you have a big oil price shock, or you make a mistake of the kind that I would say they made in 2021, so inflation's well above 2%, does that mean that even if I told a story where inflation should come back to 2, but on average inflation target, you have to have the recession, even if you don't need it, so as to deliver 2% on average? And this was the first thought I had when they announced this. I thought, what are they gambling on this never happening, on never having bad luck on the upside? If you have bad luck on the upside, you'll say, oh, we've had really bad luck on the upside. Oh, so we're going to have a recession. Oh, well, a few million people will lose their jobs. Never mind, we'll hit our target on average. This is being taped. This was stupid. It was a stupid solution to a genuine problem. The flaw I think they did in the way they set up their review is you need to be very clear when you have a public review whether doing nothing is on your agenda of possibilities. And they basically conducted the review in a way that there had to be a change. But I suspect they couldn't think of one that was good. And they should have stayed where they were, but they boxed themselves in. And that's an elementary mistake in government that's nothing to do with central banking. And the staff of the Fed should have known better. And I hope to live long enough to know whether the staff advised the bosses that they should have no change as a possibility. No change isn't very exciting, and you get criticized it for a lot. But sometimes, if you can't think of an improvement, it's better to stay where you are. So I don't enjoy holding that view, because it's a very, very fine institution.
We have time for one more question. All right, I'll take it. So what you just described there, though, this asymmetric, you praised Volcker earlier, so let me just challenge you, because, I'm still looking for places for us to argue tonight. Volcker's famous for sort of trying to, if he was adopting some sort of monetarism, but certainly monetary aggregate targets, only he's famous for never hitting them, right? They're constantly missing the target.
Yeah.
And so, in some level, there's value in announcing the target, right? And maybe this move to sort of average inflation was to suggest that we have been missing the target on the downside continually, and we are going to not react instantly and, fiercely to something above 2.
I think they could have just said that. Normally, thinking about how you'll explain something to your dad or your best friend from school that's gone into a different walk of life is going to serve you quite well. So I think you just put it quite well. But that's not the same as saying we're going to target inflation on average. True. And by the way, I think if they were here, they would say, well, they didn't mean what I've said. But then they have to say, oh, so the words don't quite mean what they seem to mean. And you also need to use words in a way that has the same meaning with different audiences. One of the things that I think is really hard to get right, and I've seen people who can get it right, it's terribly hard, is you've got this policy, and you might be explaining it in an MIT economics seminar, or in front of your Congress, or to a class of political scientists, or in a trade union club, or to your mates down the bar. And you're going to use completely different language in those setups, and you need to say the same thing. And if you say one thing, if you just start to change the meaning ever so subtly, that if you say at the MIT seminar, of course what we're really doing is this, but I can't quite explain, I can't say that elsewhere. You need to use different words to say the same thing. And when you're designing regimes, you need to think about that. Can we explain this to everybody, different words, but where the meaning doesn't change? And I think their regime is one where they say, well, we don't really mean what Paul says. But we understand why Paul thinks it might say that. Well, what? I think they messed up. Now, they did say, and this was kind of good and bad, but kind of ex post is good. They did say, well, we'll have another look at this regime in a few years' time. You might remember the exact words. What was bad about that is you don't announce a regime and say, well, we're going to junk it, of course, in a few years' time. Because
There goes credibility.
You kind of want these things. You say, this is what we're doing. It's like a constitution in that sense. But the good news is that since it didn't work, they can junk it.
Junk it. I think that's where we need to stop. And
but you should be proud of this institution. So the fact that I've criticized it, and I have, it shouldn't diminish your pride in this institution at all. And for those of you that are American citizens, rather like my country, we have very few great institutions left. Your court is not that good. Parts of your Congress are in a mess. The Federal Reserve is something to be immensely proud of. And for America's position in the world, and actually for my country's position, my part of the world, for European safety, the security that you provide to the free world depends a lot on the value and the stability of the dollar. I've got a book coming out in the autumn that says, if the Pax Americana has an unknowing headquarters, it is the Federal Reserve Building in Washington. So these criticisms are offered because I think it really matters. I think it matters to our way of life, frankly. I think that's how big the stakes are. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah,